inviting me to come today and talk about my new book, A True Story. As was pointed out, I am a professor in the sociology department at Lehigh University, and I'm here to talk about this book that came out this past February. So I start by telling people I'm a professor in the sociology department, but I find that oftentimes people don't know what that means exactly. Most people have never taken a sociology class. They might have some idea of what sociology is, but maybe it's the wrong idea. So I always like to sort of talk at the beginning of a presentation about what it means to say that I'm a sociologist. And I always tell my students, don't ever start a paper with a dictionary definition, but I'm going to violate that rule today. And I'm going to start this presentation with a dictionary definition, which is that sociology is the systematic study of the development and structure, interaction, and collective behavior of organized groups of human beings. So the underlying here is my own, it's not Merriam-Webster's. So these are the two kind of key takeaways here that I think are important. So it's systematic, it's not kind of haphazard, there are specific methods we use, specific procedures we use, and it's also about collective behavior. Sociology is about how people do things in groups. Sometimes we look at the individual, yes, but usually when we're looking at the individual, it's to better understand how that individual is shaped by the groups of which they're a part. And there are various areas of sociology that we study. I tend to focus on gender, sexuality, and what we call deviance, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also culture. And part of that is pop culture. So for several years now, I've been teaching a class at Lehigh called The Sociology of Reality TV, which I've now turned into a book. You're going to get kind of just a little sliver of that book today. So I always like to start by kind of giving this anecdote, which is that one time I was at a bookstore and I was giving a presentation, much like this one, on my book. And this woman kind of walked up, and she was just a patron of the bookstore, so she wasn't there for the presentation. She's like, "What's this book about?" And I was like, "It's about reality TV." And she just looks at me and she goes, "Ugh, why?" And some of you might feel that way as well. Why write a book about reality TV? Maybe you think it's fun to watch, but it's just kind of frivolous fun and it's not very meaningful. Or you think it's not fun to watch and you absolutely hate it and you don't know why anyone would dedicate a book to it. So why focus on these programs? Because I do think it's important in some key ways. So by way of explanation, I invite you to participate in a short challenge. If you have a piece of paper handy, if you have your phone or your computer, what have you, or even just in your own head. And don't look up the answers to these questions because that kind of defeats the purpose of the exercise. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this. I give this challenge to the students in my Intro to Sociology class. So I'd like you to make two lists, either in your head or physically. In your first list, write down as many current US Supreme Court justices as you can name. They have to be current. In the second list, write down as many Kardashians as you can name. Jenners count. So I'm going to give you like a minute to just think that through and do that now. So if you're just joining us, look like a couple of people just signed on here. I'm inviting you to participate in a really brief challenge. Please don't look up any of the answers to the questions because it defeats the purpose. You can do it afterwards if you want. As many current US Supreme Court justices as you can name in one list. In the second list, as many Kardashians as you can name. So do that now. We'll come back in like a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at your two lists and see how you did. Did you come up with more Supreme Court justices, or did you come up with more Kardashian Jenners? Maybe you came up with more Supreme Court justices. When I give this exercise in my Intro to Sociology course, usually among the hundreds of students, this is a big lecture class, only a few, if any, are usually able to name more Supreme Court justices than Kardashians. And this is not to throw my students under the bus. They're very smart students. I personally forget some of the justices sometimes, especially there's been a lot of turnover lately. And technically, there are more Kardashian Jenners than there are justices, so maybe it's just easier to name them. Okay. But I think it does tell us something about the cultural salience of reality TV and its stars, that even at this kind of elite university with these smart students, almost all of them are able to name more Kardashian Jenners than they are Supreme Court justices. So we could look at that and we could just bemoan it and talk about the youth of today, or we could use that as a data point and say, well, this tells us something about what a phenomenon reality TV is, and maybe we should be paying attention to it. So why care about reality TV? Well, for one thing, it's a lot of the TV. It's a lot of the mass of TV that's on right now. It's nearly half of all TV is reality TV. Vastly more Americans are watching reality TV than not. And even those who don't end up watching end up knowing what's happening on these shows. So you yourself might want to be one of those people if you have never seen any of the Kardashian shows ever, but you still are able to name at least some Kardashians. Most of us know Kim, right? So it's kind of out there in the cultural ether. It's inescapable. So a lot of it's being produced. A lot of us are consuming it. Even those who aren't consuming it end up knowing information about it. Like my husband, for instance, who does not watch any reality TV, but is always able to tell me what's happening on reality TV because he reads about it in mainstream media like the Washington Post and the New York Times. He just told me yesterday, Teresa Giudice is getting married today from Real Housewives of New Jersey. So it's out there kind of in the cultural ether, even the mainstream media. But perhaps most importantly, reality TV impacts us as viewers. How can it not when it's so much of the TV we're watching and so much of us are watching it? So how does it impact us? Well, one study showed that among participants who were exposed to an episode of the show The Biggest Loser, which is like this weight loss show, they walked away with a significantly greater dislike of overweight people versus people who were exposed to a nature show. But these shows arguably have constructive outcomes as well. Another study published in the American Economic Review found strong evidence that the show 16 and Pregnant had reduced births by teens. This is a show that follows teens who give birth. And of course, we can't talk about the impact of reality TV without talking about former President Donald Trump. Now, do we know that his stint on The Apprentice caused or accelerated his rise to the White House? No, we don't have data for that. We never could. But I think it's reasonable to believe that all of these people viewing him kind of in this position of power, wearing a suit, barking orders, being portrayed in this as a decision maker, helped to facilitate his rise to the White House. So as frivolous as we might like to think reality TV is sometimes, it does have an impact on us individually and our culture more broadly. It affects how we move through and perceive the world. So it impacts you, whether you're a fan of the show or not, and whether you even watch these shows. But reality TV is also important, and this is what I mainly argue in the book, because of what it can actually teach us about ourselves. And when I say what it can teach us about ourselves, I mean in kind of a broad sociological way. Teach us how we as individuals are impacted by society, about the groups and organizations in which we move, and about kind of the broader structure of the society in which we live. Now, one immediate response to this is, how can it teach us anything? These shows are fake, fakeity fake. I hear this a lot. How can you learn anything from reality TV? These shows are fake. Obviously, these shows are not 100% really real, right? Certain people, our personalities are cast for the shows. The footage is edited and reconfigured, called Frankenbiting. They kind of reconfigured around certain plots they want to tell. The The people on the shows are plied with alcohol and lack of sleep and probing questions. Of course, it's not a pure mirror of reality. The thing is that no cultural product created by human hands can ever offer us a pure reality. Even documentaries or news reports, people are making edits. They're deciding what to cover. They're deciding which stories to tell and how to tell them. So reality TV doesn't have to be a pure reflection of reality, which again, it can't be because nothing is, in order to teach us about ourselves and things we culturally value and how we organize our social lives. Now, another rejoinder is that people might argue that reality TV presents an extreme, exaggerated version of reality. And that's absolutely true, right? These shows cast extreme personalities. They often put them into extraordinary circumstances that seem to bear little resemblance to our own lives. But sociologists of deviance, and coming back to that term deviance now, have long argued that we can understand the core of social life by looking at the extremes. The extremes are incredibly instructive for helping us to understand everyday social norms. Now, I want to be clear that when I use the word deviance here, I know that might be like a jarring term to some people. In common parlance, it kind of has a moralistic ring to it. But in sociology, we just use the term deviance to talk about behavior that strays from society's norms in kind of just an objective way, not good or bad, right or wrong, just objectively strays from a norm. And think about the term standard deviation. That's kind of where it comes from. And so again, sociologists of deviance have long argued that we can understand the core of social life by looking at the extremes, what Stephen Epstein calls the centrality of marginality. And again, there's a long tradition of this. Notably, the sociologist Harold Garfinkel, for instance, famously had his students participate in what he called breaching experiments, where they would violate kind of everyday commonplace norms in order to better understand those norms. So the classic one was he would have his students go into an elevator and face the wrong way. So face the inside, face the other people inside the elevator, and see how the people would react to people facing the wrong way. It's not against the law to face the wrong way in an elevator, but it certainly violates the norms. He also had students go to a store and buy something and then haggle over the price of that item. Not a store where you would normally do that, like a kind of Target. Target wasn't around, but that kind of situation, going to Target and haggling over the price of a loaf of bread. So through these kind of small scale disruptive practices, Garfinkel argued, these students exposed our kind of tacit everyday social guidelines. So I'd argue that the deviance on reality TV is actually in some way conformity to society's norms, but in a really extreme way. Sociologists call this rate busting. So the reality TV actually serves as kind of a funhouse mirror. And in the funhouse mirror of reality TV, we actually see many of our own everyday traits exaggerated. So by tracing the contours of these exaggerated caricatures, we can come to a better understanding of them. So for instance, gender on reality TV, it's a drag. What do I mean? I mean that people on reality TV are often performing gender in really kind of exaggerated, kind of dragged up ways, even if they're not literal drag queens, like the drag queens on RuPaul's Drag Race. So when we talk about gender in sociology, we tend to think of it as a social category, not a biological category. So our kind of understandings and meanings and practices around how we perceive biological sex. Contrast that with biological sex, on the other hand, although that dichotomy is kind of murky at times. But so we tend to think of gender as something that's socially constructed and as a social category. And people perform gender in their everyday lives. But on reality TV, those performances of gender are often like dialed up to 11. We see this with the drag queens on RuPaul's Drag Race, who are performing femininity in this really amplified way. But we also see that with, say, the contestants on a show like The Bachelor, who are also performing gender in a really amplified way, with eyelashes out to here, long hair. If they have short hair, it's usually a problem. Wearing bedazzled evening gowns at 10 a.m. They're doing this exaggerated performance of gender. But they can show us how we're all performing gender every day. Most of us are performing gender every day in our everyday lives. We're just doing it in kind of more muted ways. Maybe we're not wearing bedazzled evening gowns at 10 a.m., but most people, most of the time, are performing gender in ways that conform to society's idea of what a man should be or what a woman should be. Not everybody, but most people, most of the time. So again, reality TV shows us how, in this kind of heightened, exaggerated way, we all perform gender in more muted ways in our everyday lives. So reality TV can teach us about kind of a myriad of social issues, but my main focus today actually is not going to be gender. It's going to be on social class and what reality TV can teach us about social class. So social class, we're probably all aware that social class exists. Different people have different amounts of money and can afford different things and different lifestyles. This is probably not like groundbreaking news to any of you. But reality TV can be used as a kind of teaching tool to show us how the American class system operates and kind of illuminate that for us. So what do we mean when we talk about social class? Here it's useful to look at the work of Karl Marx. So we count Karl Marx as among the founding fathers of sociology, strangely, even though he never called himself a sociologist really, but in some ways his work was fundamentally sociological in nature. If you don't know anything about Marx, writing in the mid-1800s, Marx defined class as a group of people who share the same material circumstances. And he generally looked at these two large classes, although he noted that there were some gradations within them. But he generally looked at these two large classes, the bourgeoisie on one hand and the proletariat on the other. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners, the rich people who control the means of production. The proletariat, the worker bees, lower income, working in the factories. So the proletariat performs the manual labor that's essential for a capitalist industrial society, while the bourgeoisie disproportionately profits from that labor. And Marx really thought about history writ large as a story of conflict between groups fighting over limited economic resources. And these groups come into sharp focus on reality TV. For instance, on a show like Undercover Boss. So if you've never seen Undercover Boss, the premise here is that literally a boss goes undercover. So they take the boss of a corporation, usually a CEO or similar role, and they put them in a disguise and they have them working among the everyday kind of employees of the organization to kind of get a feel for what it's like to actually work in the organization that they're effectively running. So we see Rick here, who's the CEO of Checkers and Rallies, who is now disguised and is working as a burger flipper. And in this scene, Rick is failing in his work as a burger flipper. He has no idea how to do this labor. He's not doing it very well. Again, he's not accustomed to be doing this kind of manual, one would say proletarian labor. It's really highlighting the differences between these two groups, bourgeoisie and the proletariat on the other hand. But as Marx also said, it doesn't really it's not a foregone conclusion that the class system exists in this way. It doesn't have to be. And in fact, what value we assign to what work is not a foregone conclusion either. So why does a CEO earn more money than a burger flipper? Yes, there are obvious rejoinders to that, obvious answers. You might say, it's the law of the market, being a CEO is highly skilled work, it requires a college degree, etc. Yes, those things are all true. But is the work of a CEO actually inherently more important to society than the work of a fast food worker? Maybe, maybe not. But in fact, some of our most highly compensated work is not the work that's crucial to the functioning of society, and vice versa. So food preparers literally hold our lives in their hands every day, as we learn every time there's a new E. coli scare. In the early days of the pandemic, the people deemed essential to the infrastructure were not CEOs. They were relatively low-paid workers, like grocery store stockers and delivery people. Often, there were doctors as well, of course, but often there were these low-wage earners. So Marx shows us this, and the Kardashians show us this as well. Bear with me here. One common critique of the Kardashians is that they haven't earned their fame. They don't do anything. They don't contribute. They don't even have a talent like singing or acting, which they have actually agreed with. And that's true, that a lot of reality stars simply gain money and fame simply by being filmed. But when hasn't this been true? There have always been people who are famous for being famous. Like royalty didn't do anything to earn their fame. They're famous for being part of a family, much like the Kardashians. So while it may really annoy us that Kylie Jenner earns $1 million per Instagram post, there's precedent for this because how much money you make has never been fully aligned with how objectively important or even how socially valued your work is. But because our class system is not a foregone conclusion, because it's vastly unequal, sociologists have argued, we tell narratives that tend to buffer it in certain ways, that keep it going. We send out images and we say things to justify that this class system exists. So how do we do that? Well, sociologist Patricia Hill Collins has coined the term controlling images to refer to media's stereotypical portrayal of marginalized groups. And she says these portrayals, these images, these stereotypes that we see like on our screens normalize the power structure. And they allow us to view facets of our culture like racism and sexism as natural and inevitable. Because if we think about these things as natural and inevitable, then they're kind of easier to stomach. And we don't actually have to think about our own roles in perpetuating them. And these stereotypes, these controlling images are all over reality TV. They're there when it comes to race and gender, and they're there when it comes to social class as well. For example, do you know who this is? You might know that that's Honey Boo Boo Child. Extra points if you know that her given name is Alana Thompson. So if you've never watched Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, and I won't make you admit whether you have, but I'll admit that I have, it focuses on this kind of lower class / working class family of Alana here. It's actually a spin-off of the show Toddlers and Tiaras, which was about child beauty pageant contestants. And then there's some debate in the family about whether they actually qualify as quote unquote rednecks, just their word. The show repeatedly emphasizes their stereotypical kind of hick qualities. Their grammar is creative. They intersperse their sentences with words not found in the dictionary. And the show also notably includes their bodily emanation, their farts, their burps, rather than editing them out, which is a specific choice. So let's think about Alana here as a controlling image. If we see an image like this on our screen, we have to think about, well, why is this existing? What urge is it feeding? What kind of cultural work is this show doing for us? Well, it presents us with this controlling image that legitimates this class system that we've created. But these kinds of controlling images regarding the class system are nothing new. In fact, we've been wringing enjoyment from lower class stereotypes for hundreds of years. As sociologist Jennifer Lena points out, the idea of respectable people being entertained by demonstrations of working class or poor lifestyles is as old as the bourgeoisie is as a class. And Lena writes about how beginning in the 1800s, elites in London and New York would attend what they called slumming parties, where they would go into kind of poor and immigrant urban areas for the purpose of spectacle. These trips allowed these elites to participate in activities like rat pit gambling, which was really just betting on how long it would take a terrier to kill a rat in a hole in the ground. So it's hardly a stretch to draw a line between the rat pit of yore and the mud pit belly flopping of Alana Thompson, Honey Boo Boo Child today, and other reality shows as well. We see this on My Big Fat American Gypsy Wedding, which is also a show that tends to focus on kind of working class, lower class individuals. And who among us did not watch Tiger King during the early days of the pandemic? Again, I won't make you admit whether you did. But although some viewers might find these programs entertaining because they identify with the characters, or in the case of Tiger King, the crazy plot twists, did she kill her husband and slice him up in the meat grinder? I don't know. I don't think we'll ever know. But they also attract us because they enable us to slum in a certain way. Here Comes Honey Boo Boo teaches us that we may want to visit the rat pit to remind ourselves we are not like those people over there. We are not like the rat pit. We're not of the rat pit. So just as slumming parties ultimately boosted elite sense of their own superiority and reinforced class boundaries, middle-class viewers today are able to use these programs to kind of symbolically distance themselves from working class culture and working class people. So when Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, the show displays its family speaking unintelligently and behaving impulsively. It suggests that they're responsible for their own social position, that they are where they belong, that rather than consider too deeply the structural realities of that system, our appropriate response is to sit back and laugh and be entertained. So we've established that we have this class system, it's artificially created, and we tend to justify it and kind of bolster it with these narratives about what upper class and lower class people are just like, so that again, we can kind of believe that people are just, they are where they belong within this system. But we bolster the system in other ways as well. And one of these ways is by creating hierarchies of taste. And reality TV shows us this too. So what do I mean by hierarchies of taste? So to understand what that means, I want to go back to our original definition here of social class. So recall that for Marx, a class is a group of people who share the same material circumstances, have roughly the same amount of money. There's the bourgeoisie, factory owners on the one hand, the proletariat, kind of wage laborers on the other. So building on that theory, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu argued that class is actually more of a constellation of things. Yes, it's absolutely about how much money you have, but it's also about how people with roughly similar amounts of money share the same habits, practices, and internalized understandings of the world, even share the same tastes in certain things. He found that our preferences in things like food and music are highly aligned with our class status, specifically the class into which we were kind of born and raised. So in particular, there's lowbrow culture and there's highbrow culture. Again, he's not saying these terms in kind of a negative way. He's just objectively kind of looking at how we evaluate culture as a society. And he says people with more money are socialized more often to enjoy what we would think of as highbrow culture. For example, it's telling, but it's probably not surprising to anybody, that the Honey Boo Boo clan attend an event. It's called the Redneck Games. We don't see them going to the museum. We don't see them going to the opera. So what Bourdieu's saying really is that we tend to think about taste as something that's just spontaneously generated, that's just totally biological. I like chocolate ice cream, you like vanilla, that's just our taste. But in fact has this really strong social component and is strongly aligned by the class into which you were born and raised. So why should we care about that? You might say, okay, well, you like champagne, I like Bud Light, who cares? We just like different drinks. Well, we should care, according to Bourdieu, because this brings us back to taste hierarchies. These distinctions actually matter, Bourdieu argues, because we think about them as being hierarchical. Certain tastes are connected with certain class positions, and a hierarchy is formed. So it's not just that the opera and the Redneck Games are just different pastimes, it's that one becomes more codified as more legitimate and more valued than the other. And it's no accident that the one that is more legitimate and valued is associated with higher class consumers, higher social class consumers. And we see this a lot on makeover TV shows, where things that cost a lot of money are seen as good and legitimate and right, and vice versa. So for instance, we see this on the show What Not to Wear. If you've never seen this show, these two stylists who take so-called fashion victims and they teach them how to dress better, and also they have their hair done and their makeup done and have a better sense of style. And on this show, oftentimes things are evaluated as cheap, and that's a negative term. So cheap doesn't just mean it doesn't cost a lot of money, it's associated with being negative, whereas expensive, luxe, things that cost a lot of money are seen as more authentic and good and right. This is also particularly pronounced on the show Project Runway, which, if you've never seen or heard of Project Runway, is a design competition where semi-novice, but not really sometimes, designers compete in a series of challenges, making clothes. And then a few of them at the end, who make it to the end, get to go and show a whole collection at Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week usually. So what's happening on Project Runway, again, we see these hierarchies of taste being formed. So fashion journalist and editor Nina Garcia, who you see here, has been one of the show's judges since its inception. And she talks about the designer's taste level so often that it's become almost a catchphrase and a meme. I question your taste level. But the very concept of a taste level is very interesting. And indeed is the whole premise of the show, right? That suggests that our fashion choices aren't just like subjective and meaningless. I like one thing, you like another. Rather, the whole premise of the show is there's some objective tiered index by which fashion choices can be evaluated. And judges like Nina Garcia often confirm that this taste hierarchy, again, is strongly aligned with economics. So she often uses the praiseworthy exclamation, "This looks expensive," when she's praising a particular design. So again, we see richness, money, being associated with what's good and right and valuable, and cheapness, lack of money, being kind of derided on these shows. So bottom line, what does all this tell us? Okay, so to review, we have a hierarchical class system. I don't think anyone would deny that. The class status is not always associated with actual social importance, like objective importance of the work. Sometimes the people being paid the least are the most important to our infrastructure, and vice versa with Kylie Jenner and her $1 million Instagram posts. But ultimately, we create narratives about taste and about behavior to support the class system, to sort of naturalize and explain away this system that isn't natural. It doesn't exist in nature. We've created it socially. And to tell ourselves that people are where they are because they just belong there. It's not because of this system, this unequal system that we've created. And so we bolster that with narratives of controlling images, especially seen on reality TV. So why did I choose to talk about social class today? I could have picked any chapter of the book. I'm happy to give a talk on it, but nearly all reality TV has class lurking in the background in some way, revealing how our material circumstances impact our movement through life, from where we live and how we're educated to when we die to what we like and buy. Reality programs take us on a tour through the class system, from the communal cheese ball jar at Honey Boo Boo's house to a Real Housewives' $25,000 sunglasses. And in doing so, they illuminate this system and the types of narratives and practices that we use to keep it buoyed. They show us how class designations ultimately translate into evaluations of taste, morality, and legitimacy that impacts the type of people we giggle at and the types of people we admire. So what does this mean for us, though, as viewers, if you are a viewer of reality TV? So it's interesting because I've been critiqued before for being an apologist for reality TV, and I don't think that's necessarily true. I think reality TV is objectively problematic in a lot of ways, some of which I've talked about here today. But does that mean we should all be ashamed of watching reality TV and stop immediately? I obviously don't think so, because if we're bad people for watching reality TV, then I'm definitely in trouble. So my objective here today is not to ruin these shows for you if you do like them. And it's also not to get you to like them if you don't like them. Not watching reality TV is also a perfectly valid choice. But by pointing out they're making fun of low-income people and other groups we haven't even discussed, hopefully you can come to a deeper understanding of what's happening on reality TV and what that reflects about us as a culture. Especially because reality TV didn't create these social inequalities. Again, it's a funhouse mirror. It's just the long shadow that we've cast. So looking at it is instructive in a multiple in multitude of ways. And finally, looking at reality TV in this kind of more intellectual way helps us to learn to think more broadly about the products that we create as a culture more broadly, and what they say about this culture that created them, not just when it comes to reality TV, but other forms of media as well, like music, news, and scripted TV. So I just want to conclude by thanking again the Carey Memorial Library and Matt Schumann for inviting me to give a talk here today. And I look forward to any comments or questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. If anyone has any questions, please submit them via the Q&A, or you can actually just raise your hand and I can unmute you. I wrote a couple things down while you were talking, in case of, while people type or something. I thought the comparison between like the historical thing of like wealthier people going to slum parties and comparing that to like us virtually doing that by watching these shows is a really interesting comparison. I'd love to read more about that. I also felt like there's a sort of irony too, because I don't know Honey Boo Boo's like net worth, but I how many people that end up on these shows end up like ascending the class that they were maybe in before.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it is a little problematic even to talk about Honey Boo Boo as being from like a working class or lower class status. In season one, that's true, right? But as time went by, yes, they did earn money from the show and from the spin-offs, and and fame and notoriety as well, obviously. So I'm thinking more of kind of season one Honey Boo Boo when I'm thinking about like the way that they're portrayed. But it's not just Honey Boo Boo, right? There's like I could have picked one of a dozen examples of lower class or working class people on reality TV who are being portrayed in this way that it kind of invites us to be voyeuristic, and also kind of invites us to feel superior to the people that we're seeing on our screens.
Right. And I also was thinking, as as people become like more seasons go on of a reality TV show, there's more self-awareness potentially, and like that I assume impacts the like quality of the show or the verisimilitude of the reality aspect of it. I don't know if
yeah, but I think in some ways the edges of the caricatures get even sharper, right? Because people are now playing into the character that's expected of them.
I thought too, when you're using the funhouse mirror metaphor, it made me think of like we accept a lot in like satire of like in literature or movies and TV, if it's like that's under the umbrella that it's fictionalized. Yet I feel like there would be similar qualities between the two, but the name of reality TV gives us like the expectation that this is somehow captured on the spot, even though there's like 5 different camera angles and microphones and everything. But why do we accept it in one way but are critical in others, and for reality TV? I don't know if my question made any sense.
Yeah, no, I think, well, people do get really angry about reality TV not being really real. It doesn't, fiction doesn't purport to be really real.
Sure, right.
Right. And so I think they're angry that it's purporting to be one thing. And of course, we all know that it isn't. But at this point, we all know that, I mean, most of us are watching with a heavy dose of skepticism, right? At this point in 2022, after reality TV has been here for decades and decades. So, yeah, I know. Again, I think they're just reacting to the fact that it's purporting to be something that it's not. But of course, it's not really real. Although it's interesting because I thought your question was going to be something else, which is that like fiction can get away with things that that reality TV can't. But I actually argue in the book that in some ways reality TV can get away with being incredibly stereotypical, especially in the way that it portrays marginalized groups like people of color and lower class people and LGBTQ people, because it's just reality. It's just reality, right? But of course, it's not just reality. It's being
Right.
packaged in a particular way and they're casting particular people, right? But in some ways, right, I don't think you could get away with writing a lot of these shows because it is so stereotypical what we're seeing on our screens.
Exactly. Yeah. That like the lines kind of blur. I was curious if in your research, have you found, does reality TV have the same impact in other countries or cultures as it does in the United States?
Yeah, so I mainly focused on reality TV in the United States. But of course, it's not just in the United States. And actually, a lot of the shows that we think like Survivor are just like basically import. They're shows that we kind of snagged from other countries and remade as our own. So I think it is interesting that reality TV, in some ways, is very American, especially the shows that I examine in the book. But it's really, I mean, a global phenomenon. And I think there are a lot of things about reality TV that really kind of make it transcend kind of nation and culture, and the fact that there are like just these characters on these shows who are these broad archetypes, right? Like the villain and the hero and the pretty one and the smart one. And so there's always kind of someone you can kind of grab onto, regardless of what country you're from or what your culture is. So I think there are elements of reality TV. They tell simple stories about heroes and villains and winning and losing. So I think there's a lot of reality, kind of the broad strokes of reality TV that in some ways just kind of appeals to human nature. Although I do think there's a lot that's very kind of American about the TV that we watch here in the United States.
Hmm. Could you go or talk a little bit more about how we enforce like the hierarchies of taste? Um, because sometimes if I consume content that's like, oh, it kind of blurs, like it like uses both highbrow and lowbrow in it, like I have to be aware that of like what constitutes that to make that like appealing. But how do, like, with however many millions of people live in the United States, how do we, and all the disagreements we have, how do we agree on these hierarchies of taste?
Well, because it's the things that are associated with wealthier people or tend to be, right? The things that cost more money tend to
Hmm.
be. So yeah, I mean, there are. So this was kind of a broad strokes presentation. It does get more finely grained, right? Because people have argued that we become more, it's called omnivorous, that we people have both mixtures now, really both highbrow and lowbrow tastes. But it's mainly like elites that are able to have those kind of mixtures, or people of a higher class status that are able to have those kind of mixtures where, yeah, they're mainly consuming like elite goods, but maybe sometimes they'll watch Real Housewives and slum in that particular way. But that's okay because they're still consuming these high class goods.
Hmm.
So yeah, but it's not like an agreement that we all like get together and decide that
No,
the
no, I
opera
know.
is better. Right? No, I know, but right. So it's we don't have to agree on it, but it's been so long that we've had these hierarchies locked into place. That's just that's how we're educated and raised.
Hmm. Um, Maybe a last question could be, what are some of your favorite reality shows?
Oh, I like that question. So my favorite reality show of all time is RuPaul's Drag Race.
Same.
Um, Yay! As someone who studies gender, I just find it just really interesting on a sociological level. I've everything I know about drag, I've learned from RuPaul's Drag Race. And I think it's a really good example of, this is probably why people say I'm an apologist for reality TV. Yes, there's a lot of negative that can be said about reality TV, and I'll say it. I'll be the first to say it. But there are some positives as well. And one of the things is that reality TV kind of takes us into areas of society that scripted TV doesn't often take us. It takes us into like the nooks and crannies of society where you're not going to see on prime time on NBC or CBS or ABC. You're probably not going to see a show about drag queens on ABC at 8
Hmm.
p.m. Right? But RuPaul's Drag Race has been on for years and years and years and is in some ways a wildly successful show. So I love that reality TV has something to teach us that scripted TV hasn't taught us.
Wow, well, that's really interesting. Um,
So your favorite show is RuPaul's Drag Race too?
Yeah, I watch it with my friends and my wife. I've watched it for I don't know 6, 7 years, maybe. I don't know, like going back to like season 5 or something. I don't remember when it was, but yeah, I like it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you watch it. So the other thing about reality TV that I think is really interesting is that right, we like deride it. You're not supposed to admit that you watch it, but it actually brings people together because
Yeah,
people commune to watch it. We talk about it, and it actually connects people across different class statuses, across different groups, just talking about what's happening on these shows. So it's this paradoxical thing where it's like we're supposed to turn up our nose at it. We're not supposed to admit that we like it, but at the same time, it's kind of serving this communal function and bringing us together in some ways.
yeah. I was thinking that during the presentation because like the same group we used to watch Jersey Shore when that was on, and last night even I don't know why, maybe unconsciously in advance of this talk tonight, I was flipping through channels and I stopped at Bar Rescue, which I never watched
Oh
that show,
yeah.
but then I'm like sucked into it.
We used to
And
watch
then
that all the time.
and my wife and I are like making remarks about it, but we know it's fake and we know all the things like you're saying, but there's something about it that's so alluring.
It's so formulaic too. No, we still say like that makes me so angry. At least once an episode, he's gonna say that makes me so angry.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for tonight. This was an enlightening discuss or lecture. And this program was recorded, so it will be on the library's YouTube page. I just want to say thank you again, Danielle. This was really great having you here.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.